Great. So then I'll start with this talk on the SIENNA multi-stakeholder strategy and methods for ethical development and use of AI. So what I will do in the next 20 minutes or so, I will sketch our general strategic approach for the ethical development and use of artificial intelligence, including robotics. So we found it necessary at some point to have a general strategic view of how do you get AI to be developed, deployed, and used in an ethical way. Because there's so many stakeholders involved. These stakeholders use so many different tools and instruments. You got your research ethics, you got your ethics by design, you got your regulation, you got education, you got so many different things and so many different stakeholders. Let's try to kind of put them together into one comprehensive model, which we can then use to better assess and understand what needs to be done in order to have development, deployment, and use of AI in a way that incorporates ethical and human rights considerations. So it's a strategy for ethical AI and robotics, which in our view should incorporate three elements. First of all, you want to know who your actors are. By actors, we mean something slightly different from stakeholders. I mean, actors are stakeholders, but by the actors, we mean those stakeholders who are actively involved in shaping and guiding and directing the technology. Second, we need to be clear on what are the relevant methods in a wide sense, tools, instruments, constructs that these actors can use to make a contribution to the ethical development, deployment, and use of AI and robotics. And third, we have to think about how do these actors assume their roles and responsibilities? How will they have those methods be made available to them? And in what way will they be motivated to actually use these methods and contribute to ethical development, deployment, and use of AI? So that's the challenge we have in front of us. So then what we proceeded to do is to identify the relevant actor categories. So we think that's important to do. So we have, and in our report, it's much more detailed, but roughly you have AI and robotics developers, both including researchers in a university context and R&D specialists in industry context. You have various AI and robotics development support organizations. Those could be funding organizations, they could be industry, trade organizations, and various others. You got your organizations that deploy and use AI and robotics technology, right? So we have all kinds of organizations that simply are users of AI technology. So for example, H&M or supermarket chains or government organizations, they use the technology, and that also brings with it specific ethical responsibilities to do that properly, both in the care for end users and other stakeholders. Then we have governance organizations, especially government, local, national, international, European, and standards organizations. And we kind of put those together here. We have various organizations that basically are involved with issuing either soft or hard law, so to speak, for technology. So these may be organizations that issue ethics guidelines, standards like ISO or IEEE, or hard law legislation and regulation. Then we have educational and media organizations that play an important role. Educational organizations because they educate professionals. Media organizations because they also educate and inform the general public and specialized segments in that public. Then we have an important role for civil society organizations, especially professional organizations. For example, IEEE is a professional organization that is very influential, obviously, but also Algorithm Watch, all kinds of organizations that help shape the discourse and the actions with respect to AI, as well as the general public, of course. And then a special mention for organizations and units that work on ethics and social impacts. For example, my own department, Department of Philosophy, we do a lot of ethics research in AI. So the challenge then is for all these actors to kind of play the right role in this whole process of getting towards the development, deployment, and use of AI in a way that takes into account the ethics and human rights considerations that should be taken into account. So one important dimension of that, of making sure that these actors can play their relevant roles, is to make sure that they have the right tools, or as we call them, methods. Methods for giving shape to ethical development, deployment, or use of AI. And so we distinguish 7 sets of methods that correspond to these 7 actor groups. So for researchers and developers, that was the first group. We distinguish methods for incorporating ethics into research and development of AI and robotics. And for the group of deployers and users, we distinguish methods for incorporating ethics into the deployment and use. We also distinguish for organizations in general, especially commercial organizations, corporate responsibility policies and cultures that support ethical development, deployment, and use of AI and robotics. Then we also look at the hard and soft law instruments for the governance and standards organizations. So these include national and international guidelines, standards, certification, and also under point 6, policy and regulation. And then for the education and media organizations, we have various means by which education, training, and awareness raising can be achieved. Courses and curricula, obviously, trainings, and methods for awareness raising. And of course, for the last group, the ethics and social impact analysts, we got methods for doing such studies. Okay, so what we have observed in the SIENNA project, that it's very important not only to identify and engage the right actor groups, but also identify needed methods, and to the extent that those haven't been developed well, to make sure that they're developed better. So I'm going to now go into some detail for some of these methods and kind of assess where we are with this. So for research and development of AI, and that's of course a very important aspect where ethics comes in, you do need, first of all, research ethics guidelines and protocols for research and innovation in AI and robotics. So what we've seen in recent years is that guidelines have been developed, ethics guidelines for AI, but these are not really research ethics guidelines. They have been developed, all of them or most of them, to be much broader than just being directed at research and development actors. So until recently, our belief is that we didn't really have a research ethics framework for AI. So that's what we try to develop in the SIENNA project. Ethical impact assessment methodologies to do good ethics assessment of AI and robotics in a way that's future-oriented, forward-looking. So in the SIENNA project, we developed and applied ethical impact assessment methodologies. And we did an extensive ethical impact assessment of AI and robotics. And that's our report 4.4. You can download it. We've got a very extensive assessment of all major ethical issues for AI and robotics in general, for different products, for different applications, for different user groups. Then third, ethics by design methodologies for AI and robotics. The problem with ethics guidelines or codes is that they're very general and there's often a gap between them and specific design and development practices. So we wanted to bridge that gap through the notion of ethics by design, and we have developed a specific ethics by design methodology. Now, last instrument, codes of professional ethics. We didn't really get to that. We also don't think that's our place because we have professional organizations for that, but that's certainly something where more work can be done. So, moving on to the next category, methods for incorporating ethics into the deployment and use of AI and robotics. Here again, a framework was missing in our view, and we have developed such a framework for the ethical deployment and use of AI and robotics technology in organizations. Another relevant issue here is how to relate AI ethics to corporate social responsibility, because companies generally have CSR strategies. If the company engages in either the development, deployment, or use of AI, what is the relation between the kind of ethical guidance of AI in the company and the CSR strategy? So that's also something that needs to be addressed. Not something that we've done a huge amount of work on, but certainly important. Then we have national and international guidelines, standards, and certification. This is a very active area currently for AI. That is, in 2019, we saw the development of ethics guidelines by major organizations. The European Commission has instituted the AI high-level expert group, of course. They issued guidelines. OECD issued guidelines. IEEE. So ethics guidelines have been developed by various major actors here. Now also, there's work on standards. IEEE has developed a lot of different ethics standards for AI, for general standards, but also, for example, standards for transparency, explainability, and technical standards for algorithmic bias. So very interesting work that they've done. And now also ISO, the International Organization for Standardization, in their program on trustworthy AI, they are also developing various kinds of ethics standards and technical standards that incorporate ethical criteria. So that's also currently in full development. And SEN, the European Standards Organization, is now also considering developing ethics standards for AI. So you got your ethics guidelines, your standards. In the SIENNA project, we've also worked on operational ethics guidelines, because the ethics guidelines that have been developed by organizations like the High-Level Expert Group and OECD, they're very general, and they're not directed at a specific group of actors, but at all actors. So we've been working at operational ethics guidelines for specific actors and specific practices, and making them very practical and concrete. Then there is education, training, and awareness raising. So in our view, educational institutes have a role in offering courses and modules that cover AI ethics, AI and robotics ethics, especially, of course, for students specializing in those domains. But we also feel that increasingly AI is such an unavoidable entity that also in other engineering fields and in the social sciences, people need to be aware of ethical issues in AI. So we made some specific recommendations on how that can be achieved. And we did the same also for businesses, for industry. What could industry training look like in AI ethics? And how could that be organized? How could certification be involved? We have a whole study on that as well. And then also media organizations and governments. We believe that media organizations have a responsibility to communicate ethical and human rights issues with the public, and we also make an appeal to them. Policy and regulation, of course, a very active area currently for AI. And policymakers are already quite busy with that, also taking into account some of the ethical issues. So what we've done in the SIENNA project is we have tried to further stimulate that process by our own policy proposals and regulatory proposals as well. But this is, I think, a very active area where we really need to be clear on when, whether, and how ethical considerations can have a role in policy and regulation. And then finally, the studies on the ethical and social impacts. Here also we worked on methods for doing so, and we developed studies that did foresight and social impact assessments of AI and robotics, and then followed by an extensive ethical analysis. So this gives you kind of an overview of what we think is needed in terms of actors being equipped with the right kinds of tools and apparatuses to properly address the ethical and human rights challenges of AI and robotics in the development, deployment, and use, and surrounding practices like education and policy making, to all have that in place and carried out, which is the kind of multi-stakeholder effort that is needed to make the design, development, deployment, and use processes more ethical. So this also requires a negotiation between the different actors on their respective roles and responsibilities. Who will do what? I mean, this can be negotiated differently in different communities, in different countries, but that kind of negotiation process is also important here. We also advocate certain strategic priorities for what we think is currently especially important for the ethical development, deployment, and use of AI, which are, first of all, research ethics guidelines, both for use in research institutions, universities, used by funding organizations like Horizon funding, as well as in industry. Research ethics guidelines are important. Currently, we don't have them, except we made a proposal. Ethics by design methodologies for AI, also very important in our view, to give priority, to bridge the gap between guidelines, ethics, and concrete design practices. Here we also have a proposal. Ethics standards and certification are important at this point in our view. These are things being worked on by others. Ethics standards we already discussed. Certification is worked on currently by IEEE. They're developing a whole certification program for AI and ethics. Then also AI ethics and education and training programs in higher education and in industry should be a big priority, because you need human resource development. You need people to get to understand the issues and to develop skills and the right kind of mindset to be involved with ethical issues, and that requires education and training. So developing that has a priority. And then, of course, we do need governmental regulation and policy to support ethical AI. So I will leave it here. This was, in a nutshell, a kind of strategic framework that we think is necessary to address the ethical issues in AI in a comprehensive manner.